My R5's still not here. Welcome to my channel, this is Magnus speaking, and today we're going to talk about how Sony did the perfect launch at the right time. And we're going to talk about Canon's R5. We all heard about overheating, and it's a played subject that we hear about constantly. But can there be anything done which doesn't require you to add an Atomos Ninja or record through any other means externally to actually get great quality footage? But first of all, if you're new to my channel, definitely consider subscribing. I talk about anything camera related and as well as tips and tricks. So I appreciate you, especially all the new subscribers, as well as longtime existing subscribers that keep on watching my channel. It means a ton to me, and I just love this community. It's like reinvigorating these videos again. Now my set changed a little bit. I kind of moved this room around, and I'm doing a little bit more set redesign. So for now, it's just kind of plain, but I want to like spice it up a little bit. So if it starts to change a little bit more over the next few videos, you'll know why. Okay, so Sony. First of all, the Sony A7S III is a camera that I've mentioned in previous videos, but it's also a camera that honestly has impressed me from a video perspective. There is no doubt in my mind that if you're a video related person, I would definitely recommend that you look at the Sony A7S III before you look at the Canon R5 or R6, especially the R6. R5 has some enticing but limited video features as of right now that might push you to want to get the Sonys. And the Sony A7S III is really the first camera in Sony's line of mirrorless cameras that I really am like, maybe I want that. Now, to be honest, I have not canceled my order on the R5. I still prefer the R5, and that's my final decision. But the Sony A7S III is my camera of choice should, after I test the Canon R5, and I find that it's just impossible to work with, I would probably say, you know what, I'm going to stick to my photography cameras and switch to the A7S III. But I doubt that's going to happen because I'm really leaning towards the photography features of that camera. And that, quite honestly, is the real reason why I want it. I looked at the R5 with its limitations, and knowing its limitations when it comes to 8K and 4K HQ and 4K 60 and 4K 120, knowing that all of those modes overheats, the camera in itself, to me, is a 4K 24 and 30p camera with its standard modes, full frame, as well as an awesome photography camera. And that's why I like it. But Sony, I think, really planned it. Now let's jump into it. First of all, before the Canon R5 was officially announced in their press briefing, Sony had yet to announce what they had in mind with their next camera that was supposed to replace the A7S II. Now, we've been waiting for a Sony A7S III for a long time. I can remember videos from 2018, even videos that I've done talking about the Sony A7S III and what it might have. And then here we are in 2020, and we finally got it announced. But before it was announced, there was nothing but media hype for the Canon R5. The R5, and in some respects the R6, were just the dream cameras that we've always wanted from Canon for a long time. So since December and then first half of 2016, it was nothing but R5, R5, R5. Now Sony for a while have known what they planned with the A7S III, but they also had to keep their eye on Canon, which is really the leader when it comes to cameras. Sony was feeling it, I think, because when Canon did their marketing, they purposely did marketing focused mainly on video, not really revealing too much information on what the photography can do in practice, but pretty much throwing everything in the kitchen sink when it came to video. So Sony, knowing this information, and they knew that they wanted to launch their video-centric camera, was paying attention. Now, when you saw Canon's like leaked information, they had 8K, they had 4K 120, they had all of this information. Now, Sony already more than likely had their camera developed, and their camera just did 4K 120, 4K 60, and then a bunch of bit rate and compression modes that they had in the camera to allow you to record at these different frame rates. But it didn't go past 4K. Sony really structured their plan on, okay, let's make a 4K capable camera that works and gives you impressive frame rates. They're doing flip screen for the first time. They're doing these different video-centric features and making it interesting to like a YouTube vlogger as well as a videographer and everything that would take place when it comes to recording video. But Canon specs were not only similar, but they surpassed Sony when it came to spec leaks. Someone in Sony had to say, well, this could be a problem, especially if the camera doesn't overheat. And as far as I've known, Canon's history, they really don't overheat. Their cameras in the past that I've experienced when it comes to DSLR, I have the 5D Mark IV, the Canon 6D, but also I've never heard anything on the EOS R overheating. So this overheating complex was more of a Sony thing. So Sony knew a thing or two about it. So they're probably like, these higher frame rates, did Canon do it without overheating? That's something that we've got to pay attention to, because if they figured out something that's been taking us super long to figure out, then we got to know, did they significantly change the body? But even with spec leaks on what the body looked like, it really didn't change too drastically from the EOS R. You know what? At the end, then I thought Sony was thinking, this is that final unreleased, untalked about glitch that will happen on Canon's cameras. And we need to let this happen before we announce our cameras. So I think that they had planned, and this is just me speculating, I'm not talking to anyone in Sony or Canon, but they were like, okay, so we know there's got to be some sort of heat issue, especially if you're recording 8K full frame. So now that we know this, because we work on a tech side, you know, coming from Sony, how do we combat that? Originally, the Sony announcement was supposed to be, if I remember correctly, slightly before or during Canon's announcement, like the same week or something. But there was a lot of things going on at the time that Sony said, you know what, we're going to postpone this conference until like the end of the month. I think part of that was so that they can announce their camera after Canon not only announces their incredibly capable camera, but then you start seeing what we all expected, YouTubers getting the camera in their hands, and then when it's finally out for review, you'd see a lot of these overheating problems turn up. So finally, Sony then sees all the backlash on Canon with the overheating. That's when they're like, okay, we need to prime everyone who has the camera beforehand, and also prime our introduction to the Sony A7S III with our modes, and definitely talk about that there are no overheating issues. Granted, there have been issues since then that seem to be very specialized. I mean, you have to have a camera that's A7S III that is in the sun for a very long time in order for it to overheat on you, because again, it's not built to be as weather resistant as the R5s are. So that's where you'd have like the discrepancy with outside ambient temperature affecting the Sonys a lot more than they would affect the Canons. So when Sony finally announced the A7S III, they were riding high. They had planned it. I think it worked. I think the fact that they announced their camera that did not have 8K at the right time, because they struck Canon right where they needed to strike. And the repercussions from that have been amazing, because since Sony's camera was announced relatively close to that when the R5 was announced, just slightly after, and the obvious comparison between the two would happen, the one thing that you would see a lot of is the fact that when you compare similar modes, the R5 is just overheating consistently when compared to the Sony that just handles it. And the surprise that I didn't think that Sony would know, but I'm sure that they're happy about, is that the quality of the 4K 60 and 4K 120 beats the Canon's quality, which I saw in a Tony Northrup video, which is great. This is just great. The fact that they have that is just, Sony can reap benefits from that. And I would imagine that they would lose a lot of pre-orders, or at least Canon will lose a lot of orders, thanks to the fact that those who purchased the camera and didn't get it right away and still have to wait because they're having inventory issues, obviously, it gives the user a bit more time to decide, okay, should I actually cancel my order and get the A7S III? And because the A7S III costs less, those that are video centric could be like, yeah, I'm canceling my order and going towards the A7S III rather than the R5. It's that perfect release window that those that save money for the R5 can just rebudget it and move it to the A7S III. That in itself is amazing, and I think that Sony played that well. Now I have my R5 still back ordered, still not here yet, but I'm not switching. And I've mentioned that before. I'm definitely not switching. I'm fine because I'm getting a lot more from a photography perspective and usability perspective, and the fact that I have a lot of EF glass and I've already got the EF to RF converter. I'm fine. I don't particularly need 8K. 4K 120, maybe I'll do it a couple of times, but I'm not really mad if I don't get it. And I've got a number of tests planned with the cameras that I currently have, as well as the R5, that are going to really tell me what caliber the R5 is in when compared to everything else. So that's what I've got to say about that. Now, moving on to the next topic I wanted to talk about is, can there be anything done with the R5 and R6 overheating? This in particular is outside of Atomos, outside of using an external recorder. I'm talking straight up within the camera. What are the options that we as purchasers have to avoid overheating? And what can Canon do, at least when it comes to that issue? First of all, let's go through the most unlikely and worst case scenario. If the Canon R5 and the R6 were deemed to be just completely, I mean, this would have to be everyone returning their cameras because everyone hates it because they were promised an 8K camera and didn't get it. And I mean, to the point where it would have to anger even photographers who are like returning it because they wanted the ability to get freeze frames in 8K, and if not, they had no need to upgrade from an EOS R or a 5D Mark IV, which I don't believe that that's going to happen. But let's say that did happen. I think Canon would consider recalling these cameras and then working on the body. Now, I've seen recent reports. Ordinary Filmmaker put out an excellent video where he's referring to another video. Tests were done to pretty much discover what's causing the overheating. And the overheating seems to be based on the fact of how they built the camera, obviously, and not using copper but using aluminum inside the body, and not putting enough thermal paste for a heat sink on the processor. A lot of mumbo jumbo, right? All in all, it wasn't built to dissipate that heat effectively enough. And one of the things that they did was put the CF Express card too close to the processor, which makes it a lot warmer and then just overheats the whole camera. That's why Atomos over time recording 4K HQ can last even longer if you take out the CF Express card. So that in itself exists. But if Canon does something about all of that in a recall, then potentially you can have the issue addressed, but that would cost a ton of money to do. That would also mean you have to completely change on how your factory makes the cameras going forward, as well as how it addresses all the fixes. Normally, recalls are done when a product brings danger to, I guess, any of the users, or when a product, the way it stands, has like a failure rate of like over 10%, like where it just no longer works. And I don't believe that the R5 is a camera that doesn't work. It's working as intended, basically. And those overheating limits were tested and they're working as intended. So that in itself is why Canon won't recall it. I mean, I complained about the 5D Mark IV's 1.74 times crop in 4K as well as a MJPEG codec, and so many complained about that when you had other manufacturers doing 4K much better and using the full frame. To get such a high crop on the 5D Mark IV is just a shame. However, all that complaining did not change Canon's mindset. They kept the MJPEG codec and they kept the crop. In fact, they moved the crop over to the EOS R. So that in itself was never really addressed. I don't anticipate Canon touching that. So if they're not going to adjust the body, then it's got to be firmware and software related, right? So what can you do? Well, it's already been rumored that Canon's going to put out a firmware update that will allow the camera to record, I believe, Canon Log 3. I don't believe Canon Log 2, but at least Canon Log 3, and increase the dynamic range in the camera, as well as permitting lower bit rates for the different video resolutions, as well as potentially putting RAW in there for the different video resolutions, although I don't believe that will be a thing, but it's still potential and still rumored, so none of this is addressed. But it's interesting because if they have a lower bit rate, could it potentially put less stress on the processor? I would think that it's going to cause a problem with the clarity. You're probably going to get a softer image like what you get with the standard mode. But to be able to shoot higher frame rates in that standard mode, or maybe a little bit less intensive on the processor, something just that puts it comparable, maybe that might help with the overheating issues. And could they apply something like that with the 8K, where maybe you're not getting 8K RAW without overheating issues, maybe you're not getting all-I without overheating issues, but maybe you can get an 8K with a low enough bit rate where it doesn't stress it enough. And though you might not have unlimited recording, perhaps you could extend the life of 8K footage that you can get before it does overheat. That's my hope. And another thing that they can potentially do with a firmware update is increase the temperature of what's permittable before the camera limits you on what you can record. Now, this is risky because it could cause hardware problems, especially if you go overheat it way too much and they didn't calculate it right. So that's probably like a last-ditch effort that I doubt they're going to do, because reliability is very important with these cameras. But it's an option that they do have. And if they update their firmware that permits you to do that, then potentially you might be able to somewhat, if not completely, address the overheating issues. Though I am looking forward to that lower bit rate option when it comes to recording these different modes, because CF Express cards are really expensive. However, if you're thinking of buying the R5 and then expecting that these updates will happen, then forget about it. If you need something that's more reliable when it comes to those higher frame rate modes, I would recommend the Sony, unless you're a hybrid photographer, videographer, because you should buy a camera for what it's able to do today, not what you can hope it will do tomorrow. I never expected this camera that I'm recording with right now, which is the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. I never expected to increase the resolution on what you can do with 120 frames per second, which they increased it from 1080p to 2K, which awesome. And then just offer you just more modes. And then a 4K option that you can actually get slightly more frames per second. Totally nuts. Like that I didn't expect, because I bought the camera to be able to record RAW at 60 frames per second. And day one, that's what it was able to do. Anyway, I've talked a lot. I talked enough. You guys, let me tell you, you guys have totally reinvigorated my energy for this channel. And I definitely want to keep going. And I will get the R5 eventually, hopefully, because the test that I have planned, I can tell you I have not seen online. Nobody has done the test that I have planned. And these tests are camera comparisons, R5 versus my other cameras, and a lot of quality checks to see if what we get with this camera actually surpasses what we already have in cameras. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. That's it. That's all I got to say. As always, thank you, and you can make my day if you subscribe today. This is Magnus, and I'm out. I always have noise outside. I can't help it. See you guys later.